Well, thank you everyone for being back.
Bye by now. There we go.
And it is my pleasure to introduce to you John Covach, who's director of the University of Rochester Institute for Popular Music and professor of theory at the Eastman School of Music, my own alma mater. So, I asked John something unusual about him, and listen to this. He was a Fulbright scholar in musicology in Vienna between 1987 and 1988. I believe the own founder of MahlerFest, Bob Olson, was a Fulbright in Vienna for conducting a year later. Okay, so it's very coincidental. And John is also a certified Kriya yoga meditation teacher. So please, without further ado.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you, everybody. Well, it's a delight to be here with you. For those of you who heard me talk on, I'll put that up for you here. I'll grab that. Awesome. For those of you who were at the concert on Wednesday, I did say what a delight it is to be back in Boulder again. I've been back a couple of times in the last couple of decades, but to talk a little bit about the sort of hippie side of my life. At some point in the early 1980s, I guess it was 1980 or so, I decided I had to go someplace from my suburban Detroit location and find myself. I don't know how many, if that resonates with how many of your sort of early experience, very 70s thing to do, you know. So what I ended up in a log cabin, or not, like a wooden cabin, just up from Evergreen, up right next to the National Forest. It was great. You looked out the window, you saw nothing but the beautiful mountains and all that. Outhouse, no running water. I mean, it was really rough in it. I lasted it until the snow started, and then I was back to Detroit. I couldn't find myself in the snow. So it's really a delight to be back here and really have the time to really spend some time walking around and getting acquainted with the place. For those of you who are native to Boulder, I'm sure you do appreciate what a beautiful part of the world you live in, and it's my great privilege to be with you. So, look, I probably am overly ambitious in what I want to cover with you today. So I ask for I apologize in advance for the fact that I'm going to go through some things pretty quickly in a kind of partial way. And we can always double back to things that interest you when we get to questions at the end. But I am going to move through a lot of stuff. In many ways, what I'm talking to you today is a kind of a summary and a kind of a putting together a synthesis of various articles and chapters I've written over the last 30 or 40 years since my time in Vienna when I was a Fulbright student studying music of Arnold Schoenberg and Joseph Matthias Hauer, who I'll talk to you a minute about. Of course, from the looks of me, you can see that I probably was and am a rock musician. And so from that point of view, I went from rock music to Schoenberg, back to rock music again. And so bringing all of those things together in a very sort of summary kind of fashion. So I'm sorry if I breeze past some things that really deserve much fuller treatment. In order to make that job a little bit easier, I've decided to use this slide to help orient my argument. Since I'm going to provide so many details, it's nice to be able to come back to a central point and see where we are in the argument. And so here are the main points. I'll give away the story at the very beginning here. First, I want to ask the question, can music take us beyond our everyday existence and somehow connects us with something divine or absolute? Then I want to point out that there was a culture of alternative lifestyle / spirituality in Vienna during the late 19th and early 20th centuries that impacted music. And because of my specialty, I'll focus on Schoenberg and Hauer, say a little bit about Berg, although I will double back on Mahler. Third, I'd like to make the point, there was a culture of alternative lifestyle and spirituality in the US and the UK in the late 1960s and 1970s that impacted music. And there my examples will be the Beatles, The Who, Tommy, Yes. And these two parallel late 19th century, early 20th century Viennese and sort of hippie cultures of the 60s and 70s, there is a direct history that connects these two musical cultures. So in other words, there is an underlying history of alternative spiritualities and lifestyles that runs for probably a couple of hundred years in the West, and there are a couple of places where it pops up in music in particularly pronounced ways. And it turns out that two of those very important places are Vienna, in the time that we're mostly concerned with, the 1880 through 1925 or so period, and then the late 1960s and most of the 1970s for rock music in the US and the UK. But of course, this really wouldn't be a MahlerFest talk if I didn't say something about Mahler with regard to the alternative culture in Vienna, and then also the one in New York when Mahler was in New York. So, music interests transcending the everyday. Music triggers emotion. Most of the people in this room would agree with that. But think about it. Can that emotion be one that is deeper somehow, different from the emotions usually triggered by the arts, literature, entertainment, sports, etc.? So a lot of things that we as spectators or listeners or audience members we encounter in the world draw emotional responses from us. I mean, maybe the most sort of everyday kind of one would be people watching a game, a game. I mean, a Michigan guy, you know, watching a Michigan basketball, watching a Michigan win a national championship. It's hard not to be excited when they win, and it's hard not to be a little bit bummed out when they lose. Those are certainly emotions that we experience. We may see a wonderful movie that make us want to cry, make us want to laugh, all kinds of things like that. So there's no question that when you're, I mean, what would be the use for most people of taking in entertainment if there wasn't some kind of an emotional reaction? But is that an emotion that takes you outside of yourself and into something deeper? Or is it an emotion? A good one, a satisfying one, that kind of thing? That's the question, because if we're going to talk about spirituality and emotions, it's got to go to that second place. Right? It can't just be the spirituality of everyday feeling love. You know, oh, well, this really focuses how important it is to love other people. Kind of. So that's the first concern here. And so if one can transcend everyday awareness, what is this other awareness or consciousness? I mean, what could it possibly be? Where does this quest for the absolute take us? So, you know, especially in, maybe sort of new age kind of discussions, people talk about, you know, getting to some higher spirituality. Well, that's fine, and it's wonderful that people feel all those kinds of ways. What exactly does that mean? I mean, where is that higher spirituality thing? What's the nature of it? And I think it's important as we think about music and the spirituality or the spiritual value. I say spiritual, but I don't really mean, in the case of what I'm going to talk about, spirituality in the sense that we think about it in traditional religion. So we talk about spirituality and we say, most people when they hear spirituality think, oh, that has to have something to do with God or a God or some kind of worship or that kind of thing. And that's perfectly fine when that's the case. But in this case, what I mean by spirituality, you might think of as more sort of something beyond this material, physical universe that we are in right now as we sit here in this place together. And spirituality and being beyond these emotions that I might have on any given day, prompted by various kinds of things, and thoughts or understandings that I might have beyond the usual and everyday ones that we have. If you can think of spirituality being thought that broadly, that's what I mean by alternative spiritualities and lifestyles. So this is not necessarily a quest for finding God. It's a quest for this sort of what we typically in the 70s used to call higher consciousness, right? Higher consciousness. What might be a mode like that? Well, for those of us who are musicians, I think everybody that's played music understands there's such a thing as thinking in music. That is, thinking in music is a way of just thinking about what's happening in the music without worrying about any kind of verbal dialogue. You know, so I'm playing something on the guitar and I'm thinking about what the next thing's going to be, especially when I'm improvising or making variations on various kinds of chord things. I'm not thinking words. I'm thinking in the music itself. And musicians do this all the time. I remember when I was a Fulbrighter, I was with another Fulbrighter who was doing sort of a study of language and that kind of thing in Vienna, and we had a long discussion. He was not a musician, and he refused to believe that it was possible to have any thought that didn't happen verbally. And I said, I don't know what to tell you, man. I've been playing music for like 20 years. I mean, you think in music. No, it's impossible. It can't happen because Wittgenstein says this. So anyway, what's that? Another Viennese. So what are we going to say here? So music, thinking in music is important in practical ways. But here's what I mean by thinking in music in another way. Can composers and listeners be taken to an awareness that is nonverbal? That is, in composing music, are you thinking in music in the same kind of way? And if you listen to Mahler's piece, the Mahler piece tomorrow afternoon, are you taken to some place where you're thinking in music that's not verbal? You're not thinking to yourself, this is that figure that Thomas was talking about again. In other words, it's happening in a way that's not verbal, but is totally in the music. And the question is it also possible or even pragmatic for performers to think that way? We have this romantic idea that when performers are performing, they're in the music and all this is happening. But in most cases, what we're really trying to do is manage the performance. And that involves a lot of inner dialogue about the audience and cues and syncing up with other parts and these kinds of things. So, music is great when you're practicing, but when you're performing, you really have to control. Maybe it's not pragmatic to be thinking in the music in some otherworldly kind of way when you're trying to put a performance on. Is it possible that music can be inspired, the question is here, it is possible that music can be inspired by spiritual aspiration or even depict it without actually prompting a transcendent experience. And what I'm going to talk about here in this case is going to be things that do both. So I can say that I'm influenced by meditation. I can write some lyrics that talk about how awesome it is to be in meditation. But that's not the same thing as being in meditation or drawing you into the framework that is into the frame of mind that is the meditation one. So this gets a bit to the first point in some of the issues. The second point is there was a culture of alternative lifestyle spirituality in Vienna during the late 19th and early 20th centuries that impacted music. And we'll talk about Schoenberg and Hauer as we do that. So for Arnold Schoenberg, born 1874, so I'm sure Mahler aficionados know that Schoenberg was part of Mahler's circle during the Viennese years, and Mahler was actually quite protective of Schoenberg. There's some quote, Thomas, I don't know whether it's accurate or not, that he said, "If I go, what will happen to poor Schoenberg?" This kind of thing. So Schoenberg was very much the junior partner, and about 14 years younger than Mahler. And of course, Schoenberg idolized Mahler. So for Schoenberg, the musical idea, or the musikalische Gedanke, was the key to musical transcendence. I've spent the better part of 40 years trying to convince my colleagues that they need to pay attention to Schoenberg and listen to him when he tells you this over and over and over again. But most don't want to hear it, I suppose. Schoenberg employs an organic model drawn from Goethe's science, and we'll come back to Goethe's science in just a minute here. When Schoenberg talks about the musikalische Gedanke, what is this musical idea you speak of, Schoenberg? Well, it's like this. It has both a dynamic dimension, by which I mean an idea is presented at the beginning of a piece, and like a seed, in that idea are all the potential for what that initial germ can become. And the rest of the piece becomes an unfolding of material from that initial thing, which Schoenberg called the Grundgestalt, or the basic shape. Everything becomes an unfolding of that, to the point that you get to where things that constitute contrasting material, you would think that they had nothing to do with each other. On further review, you find that at a deeper level, there's a similarity. And so the idea is that the musical idea can starts at the very beginning and unfolds the way a plant or a tree or something would do. And that's an organicism metaphor about the dynamic unfolding of material. Together with that, There's also the organic metaphor of the entire whole. And you get this expressed actually in its most literal form by Rudolf Reti, who was a student, not exactly a student of Schoenberg, but a great fan of Schoenberg's, and who took the motivic analysis thing, made it very, very popular in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Reti says that the ideal for any piece of music is that there should be no passage that can be swapped out for another passage and be viable. So you take all of the Beethoven piano sonatas or something, and if you decide, transpose it, adjust the tempo and all that kind of thing, to take the second theme out of a sonata form, or a minuet from one and a minuet trio from one and put it into another one. Reti says, ideally, this should never happen. Every piece of music should be stamped with its own DNA. Just like, if I take my arm off, I can't really sort of sew it on to another body and have it be all the same. There's a different DNA. All these metaphors are kind of imperfect, but the idea is that there is this static way in which everything that occurs in a piece of music can be seen as once as all part of exactly the same thing. So this is the idea. For example, most of us, if not told differently, expect that when composers compose pieces, symphonic pieces, they compose them from the beginning to the end. But the fact is that may be true like on a first draft, but most composers are viewing the entire piece all at once at the same time. So they may see that if they change something here, well, logic necessitates that something over here, which is a consequence of that, needs to be changed to align with it. And so they're kind of looking at the piece as a big map of the music, as opposed to a kind of phenomenological experience, which is the way that we're going to hear it. What Schoenberg says is that what's spiritual about music, what's spiritual about being a composer, is that a composer has to keep this dynamic and this static aspect in the mind's eye at the same time, and somehow they fuse into something that is neither the dynamic nor the static aspect alone, but into something more than that. And that is the kind of spiritual vision that a composer is able to have. He says that a composer is a genius who has a vision of something not yet perceptible by others. So culture is always catching up. So he, by presenting this music to you, he's giving you something that probably you're not going to quite understand quite yet. But when culture develops, it'll be something that everybody understands. And then he gets this idea from a couple of people. He gets it from Wagner. I don't know how many of you know Kandinsky's concerning the spiritual in art, but Kandinsky does a whole long stretch on this kind of thing. And it's what caused Schoenberg to say that, in 20 years or 100 years, even cab drivers will be whistling my 12-tone melodies. Well, I got to tell you, 2 years ago, I would have told you that's not true, but I think you actually can program one of Elon's cars to do a 12-tone melody. So it isn't a cab driver, but it's whatever's driving that stupid thing around that can make that happen. So this idea of an artist and a vision, and of course we see plenty of this in Mahler as well. And the other idea is that there are two things he talks about: style, which changes, and that's distinguished from idea, which is permanent. So his aesthetic theology, this idea of the spirituality of the musikalische Gedanke, applies to tonal, atonal, and 12-tone music. That's a later stage. That's downstream. The idea is the first thing, and then it gets translated into a language of tonality or atonality or 12-tone music, or you could even just popular idioms, whatever it is. Those are all the kind of the physical or material kind of dressings of the idea. But the real spiritual part of it is outside of stylistic concern. So he'd say, what could be spiritual about music? That's what Schoenberg thinks. Joseph Matthias Hauer, somebody who I'll bet you most of you have never heard the name Joseph Matthias Hauer before. He was almost the same age as Schoenberg, a little bit younger. Also a Viennese composer. Hauer actually came up with 12-tone pieces before Schoenberg came up with them. Schoenbergians will argue this, but I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Schoenbergian. I got to tell you, I've done a dissertation on Hauer and a bunch of articles, and I think Hauer had Schoenberg beat, as if that was important. But if it was important to you, probably Hauer is the one there. He wasn't a great composer, and I'll tell you, it could be because he wasn't a great composer, period. But I think there's a reason for why we don't know more about Hauer's music. Anyway, Hauer said, oh, this business about perceiving the idea and all this kind of stuff, baloney. See, the problem with you, Schoenberg, and I'm paraphrasing pretty drastically here, the problem with you, Schoenberg, is you think it's all about you. You think it's all about your personal expression and your personal ideas, but that's not what spirituality is in music. Music is about letting go of that personal. It's about letting go of that ego, although ironically, Howard will probably say, and don't forget I'm the one that told you that, but nevertheless, it's all about this letting go of the ego, right? So how would you do music if you were going to let go? In fact, if you do that, you're essentially letting go of the role of being a composer at all, right? Music stops becoming something where you write pieces for other people to perform and this kind of thing, but starts to become a kind of contemplative or meditative kind of exercise where you are contemplating the music and sort of entering into this world of the spiritual world of the 12-tone universe. So, as I say here, he was opposed to personal expression, no ego. Howard devised a series of approaches to 12-tone composition that act as lenses on the absolute. He ultimately rejects composing in favor of musical meditations and contemplations. By the time he gets into the 1940s, Joseph Matthias Hauer no longer even thinks of his pieces as giving him names like piano piece or things. He just calls them all 12-Tonspiel, 12-tone games. 12-tone plays, the play of the 12 tones. And he basically does like one a day, and he writes the date at the bottom and then sends them off to friends. So when I was doing the analysis in Europe, you'd go around to every music library, Switzerland, Germany, wherever you went, and they would have deposited from people's personal collections all of these Howard's 12-Tonspiele. And that was the only way you could sort of round them up, is to go from place to place with a travel grant and find them. So little did he care about them as compositions that he basically did them. When they were done, they were of no use to him. He sent them off to friends. And so this is another way of getting into the spirituality in music. Here's a little bit from Schoenberg, and I'll read it with some dramatic inflection here. Schoenberg says, writing in 1941 in an essay called Composition with 12 Tones, to understand the very nature of creation, one must acknowledge that there was no light before the Lord said, "Let there be light." And since there was not yet light, the Lord's omniscience embraced a vision of it which only his omnipotence could call forth. We poor human beings, when we refer to one of the better minds among us as a creator, should never forget what a creator is in reality. A creator has a vision of something which has not existed before this vision. And a creator has the power to bring his vision to life, the power to realize it. Alas, human creators, if they be granted a vision, must travel through the long path between vision and accomplishment, a hard road where, driven out of paradise, even geniuses must reap their harvest in the sweat of their brows. Alas, it is one thing to a vision in a creative instant of inspiration, and it's another thing to materialize one's vision by painstakingly connecting details until they fuse into a kind of organism. Alas, suppose it becomes an organism, a homunculus or a robot, and possesses some of the spontaneity of a vision, or you could say of the original vision. It remains yet another thing to organize this form so that it becomes a comprehensive message to whom it may concern. What Schoenberg is talking about is the basic spiritual challenge of a composer. Now, this is Schoenberg later in his life, but these were ideas that were formed very early in his life. He's only talking about the things he was hearing in Vienna around the turn of the century. All right, we move to our next point. There was a culture of alternative lifestyle and spirituality in the U.S. and U.K. in the late 1960s and 1970s that impacted music. And we'll talk about the Beatles, The Who, and Yes here just a little bit. So, the Beatles and Eastern spirituality. Those of you who are boomers like me probably know the stories about the Beatles and their approach to Eastern spirituality. This first seems to happen for the Beatles while they are filming their second film, Help. This would be in early 1965. The movie was released in August of 65. This is early 1965, and there was a scene. I don't know how many have seen the film Help at some point in their life. It's a little bit vulgar in the sense that they use in Bengal, in India, the goddess that is worshipped quite frequently is Kali. And Kali it can be a vengeful goddess and can be quite frightening. And so they kind of take this Kali worship thing, and it becomes the plot of the story is that there's going to be a human sacrifice to Kali, and the person who is going to be sacrificed has to be wearing the special ring. But somehow Ringo gets the ring, and when they get her to the sacrifice, she doesn't have it. Well, hijinks ensue as they go chasing the Beatles around, and Paul McCartney says they decided on the locations because at that point they were totally bored with doing the movie, and so they just sort of like threw out locations to Richard Lester. So it was like, well, we've never been to the Alps. We've never been to the Bahamas, so they just kind of want to have some fun. They were smoking a lot of dope during that time, and so they would get out that there's one scene where they're in Buckingham Palace that just about drove Richard Lester crazy because they couldn't do more than 20 seconds of dialogue without giggling and falling all over themselves again, right? So this is sort of what was happening with the Beatles in '65. They do this scene where they're supposed to be going into this Indian restaurant for some reason to track down. I forget what's going on. And in there, they've got this dopey combination of Indian instruments that would never happen in real Indian music. But there's a sitar there. And so, they stop them and cut, and George goes over, a guitar geek, probably, like Ken Woods or myself, it's like the first thing our minds go to is like, hey, look, there's an instrument over there. It's kind of Indian guitar or something. So he goes over there and he's like, well, this is boing, boing, this is great. So he gets real excited about this sitar, goes back, when they're in London, he buys he didn't know it was, but a cheap one at a kind of Indian import store that was right there on Shaftesbury or something like that, and has it and kind of twangs away on it a little bit, plays it with a guitar pick, which is not the way you play it, but anyway. And so they get to Norwegian Wood. They're recording the tune for the album that's on Rubber Soul, I believe, and they think it's missing something. It's missing something. John Lennon says, George, you still have that sitar? Yeah, I've got it. Well, get it. So they go get it, and he plays. Actually, if you buy one of those Beatles anthology ones, there's a version of it that has much more sitar than they ended up using. I mean, George is riffing all the way through it, So finally, they get the version they get, and it becomes famous as the first use of Indian sitar in rock music with Norwegian Wood, 1965, a John Lennon song, by the way, not a George Harrison song. Has nothing to do with Indian philosophy. So he ends up using the sitar. The sitar pops up in a bunch of different Beatles tracks, but for George, the feature tracks that involve Indian music or the sitar or some combination are Love You Too from Revolver, Within You Without You from Sgt. Pepper, and The Inner Light, which was released as a single, the B-side of Lady Madonna in early 1968. Strange for all the talk about George Harrison and Indian music that there's actually only 3 tracks you can go to that are actually those kinds of tracks. Well, it turns out that George was much more interested in the sound of Indian music than in Indian philosophy. But by the time they meet with the Maharishi, Mahesh Yogi, and he starts learning about sitar, he's turned on to the book Raga Yoga by Swami Vivekananda. You see the dates there. Paramahansa Yogananda's The Autobiography of a Yogi. There can't be a boomer who was ever involved in hippie culture who's never seen a copy of The Autobiography of a Yogi somewhere. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who at that time was real big for transcendental meditation, and Prabhupada, who is the guy who was the head of the Hare Krishna organization, which became very important in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. In Beatles music, the influences toward this kind of Eastern spirituality include Vedanta, both dual and non-dual, Advaita and Bhakti, and also the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. And so these are the sort of influences on the Beatles. Now, so it probably makes perfect sense that Pete Townsend, at about the same time, is also introduced to the same kind of Eastern philosophy, in fact, very much the same kind as the Advaita Vedanta Vedanta through Meher Baba's philosophy, which is non-dual, and in which he considers his lifestyle, the lifestyle he recommends is a very kind of strict, kind of renunciant style. You can still be a household, still have a family, but no drugs, no alcohol, no tobacco, strict vegetarian, this kind of thing. And so this is what Townsend is introduced to, probably before George Harrison was introduced to the philosophical aspects of Indian music. Pete Townsend was already getting into Meher Baba in early 1967. That's where he dates it in his autobiography. And so, as I said on Wednesday, Tommy is very much influenced by Meher Baba, the whole concept of Tommy renouncing the senses, and when that happens, even if it is because he's mistreated and all this kind of thing, once he gets into that internal environment, he realizes something important, because that's what happens when you still the mind and turn off the senses. Something important comes to you, and so then when he breaks out and he's got this fantastic skill, this pinball skill. And then of course he's rejected, and I said on Wednesday, I see Townsend's Tommy as basically a critique of hippie spirituality. Hippies wanted their spirituality fast and in a tab of LSD. And Townsend was there to say, that's not the way it happens. You've got to work. You've got to work for the real thing. And then we come to the music of Yes and many others. I'll just say briefly that their 1972 title track to the album, Close to the Edge, is loosely based on Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. Again, for boomers, that was like a high school reading, book that we all had to do, very big at the time. And then Tales from Topographic Ocean was loosely based on a passage from Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. Other sort of spiritually inspired stuff. The Moody Blues have a track actually called Om from 1968, Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, for Pete's sake. When all is one and one is all, to be a rock and not to roll. That's pure Vedanta. Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, perhaps influenced by the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the idea of one's progress between births, after death and before rebirth, and many, many others. Here are some song lyrics to kind of get you into the mood, or get you to maybe prompt your memory of what was happening back in those days. Within you, without you, we were talking about the space between us all, and the people who hide themselves behind a wall of illusion never glimpse the truth, then it's far too late when they pass away. Tommy, or See Me, Feel Me. Listening to you, I get the music. Gazing at you, I get the heat. Following you, I climb the mountain. I get excitement at your feet. Pure and easy. There once was a note, pure and easy, playing so free like the breath rippling by. The note is eternal. I hear it, it sees me. Forever we blend, and forever we fly. I'll skip the Om lyrics. Bargain, and like one and one don't make two, one and one make one. It's the pure Advaita, right? One and one don't make two, one and one make one. There is no two, there is only one, right? And I'm looking for that free ride to me. I'm looking for you. And then finally, probably the most sort of obviously cosmic of these lyrics from Yes's 1977 Awaken. High vibration go on to the sun, oh let my heart dreaming, past a mortal as me, where can I be? Wish the sun to stand still, reaching out to touch our own being, past all mortal as we, here we can be. Here we can be. Of course, he's talking about being in that spiritual place. He's all of a sudden, what is this thing there? So these all fall into the, I think, into the category of things that are clearly influenced by spirituality and influenced by the hippie spirituality of the day, which I'm going to sort of unfold for you in just a minute. But maybe it's more talking about spirituality than taking you into a spiritual state. Maybe it's more of that than the other. Whereas with Hauer and Schoenberg, the whole idea was this music is sucking you in to some place that is beyond the verbal, into this deep sort of spiritual realm. This music is more about the spiritual realm, but not leading you into it as much. You could argue albums like Dark Side of the Moon and other kind of concept albums really do take you on a journey in the way that that maybe kind of a spiritual journey might be. But we'll leave those discussions aside for just a minute. And then the last issue I want to deal with here is there's a history that directly connects these two musical cultures, and I'll take Mahler into consideration in Vienna, in New York, in the course of talking about that. So Western esotericism, Eastern philosophy. Some of the kind of mysticism I've been talking about occurs in the West and goes back to the Greeks. It goes back at least to Plato's cave in the Republic, where he talks about the images on the side of the cave and escaping the cave and all of that. That's been taken by people in the esoteric traditions as being a very, very important text for understanding spirituality. And so you get various movements in the West, Gnosticism, the idea of there's a kind of a secret wisdom, Neoplatonism, often referring to Plotinus, the Greek philosopher. He wouldn't have called his philosophy Neoplatonism. He would have called his philosophy Platonism. There's nothing new about this. This is exactly what Plato meant. Christian mystics, we can think of all kinds, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard von Bingen. Of course, for this group, Swedenborg would be an important Christian mystic to include in this. And then, of course, the whole tradition of magic. So when you talk about spirituality, it doesn't have to be stuff coming from the East. But now that you mention stuff coming from the East, interest and awareness of alternative spiritualities from the East grows throughout the 19th century as scholarship expands. It's actually really quite an interesting story how it is that we ended up with all of this Eastern stuff that we take for granted these days. If you go down to the Boulder bookstore, you find all kinds of these things. How did that eventually happen? Because 300 years ago, most people didn't know anything about any of this. Somebody here said they'd written a book on Emerson, and Emerson figures pretty importantly into the way this stuff comes. Figures. Emerson is a key figure for a lot of this, especially Eastern stuff, coming into the 19th century in the United States. So it's interesting that when the English took over India, or the tea, East Asia Tea Company, whatever it's called, East India Tea Company. They were trying to govern the Indians, and the Indians would not seem to want to follow their laws or their rules and strictures. And so the people who were in charge of ruling said, maybe what we need to do is figure out, but the problem is we're trying to put our values on them. Maybe we should try to figure out what their values are and use their sacred scripts or whatever their sort of, the books are that they revere as ways of kind of justifying the kinds of things that we're talking about. So they said, let's get some of this stuff, let's figure out what the important books are and get some of it translated. So they didn't have Sanskrit, and these books were written in Sanskrit. So they had to depend on these sadhus, these guys who were scholars in Sanskrit, but they were rather suspicious of the British, and they weren't giving them the straight story. And they'd given these translations that weren't actually very accurate translations, but served to their benefit. The British caught on to this after a couple of years, and they thought, we can't trust these guys. They're not giving us the straight story. We're going to have to actually learn Sanskrit. So they did. Turns out there's a wonderful a book, a guide to Sanskrit, written in Sanskrit, but leads sort of into it. So they figured it out, and they so they started translating all of these old manuscripts in Sanskrit, and they established the Asiatic Society in 1784 in Calcutta, which was the head of British rule in India at the time. And the big guy behind this is a guy by the name of Sir William Jones, 1746, 1794. And out of this comes the first translation, English translation of the Bhagavad Gita from 1785 from Charles Wilkins. That's the one that Emerson, is that the translation that Emerson had? Yeah, the Wilkins translation. This is the first time anybody could read much about the Bhagavad Gita in English. But once it was out, it began to circulate, and other people did their own paraphrasing and various kinds of things throughout the 19th century. Some important figures here are Max Müller, a very important German scholar who was mostly teaching at Oxford for most of his career, brought out a 50-volume series called Sacred Books of the East. All were like this gigantic translation series, and this is the first time most of these books had ever made it into English, right? So that series gets started in, what do I have here, 1879, goes through 1910. Good years for us, right? But the problem is those are all English translations, and when we think about Mahler and Schoenberg and all these guys, we're thinking about what would have been available in German to them. Well, it turns out a very interesting figure is Paul Deussen, who had brought out a book in German on Vedanta in 1883, was a close friend of Friedrich Nietzsche. A lot of Nietzsche's idea, eternal recurrence of the same, a lot of the kinds of things that he plays around with could be seen as influenced or at least prompted by various kinds of Eastern ideas that might have been part of a conversation with his good buddy Deussen, who was busy translating all of the stuff. He ended up bringing out translations of 60 of the Upanishads, big 2-volume thing, lots of them. This guy was number one sort of German expert on what was happening in Indian philosophy, and he actually had the Sanskrit to go in and work with the original himself. So also interesting to us, he was the original founder of the Schopenhauer Society in Germany, big Schopenhauer follower, and also personally knew Vivekananda. So this guy, Paul Deussen, very important in regard to the tradition. I can remember seeing on Wikipedia, or one of those sort of philosophy Wikipedias, I was looking up Paul Deussen when I was just getting started on this, and somebody had written, oh, Paul Deussen was a friend of, aside from being a friend of Friedrich Nietzsche's, basically fell into oblivion. And I thought, fella, man, you need to read a book. I mean, for Pete's sake, this guy, Paul Deussen, he practically changed the world for German philology in the second half of the 19th century. And he's buddies with Nietzsche, and he's running a Schopenhauer Society. But anyway, his books could easily have made it but once Deussen started the ball rolling, then a lot of these things started to come up. But this wasn't happening until then. You really couldn't be sitting around thinking about early in the 19th century, the Schlegels did some translations from the Bhagavad Gita, but much before 1800, it'd be tough to have much of a thought about Indian philosophy, because where would you have found it? It's also important to note, as I talk about this Western esotericism and Eastern philosophy, that occult practices and spiritualism especially, and secret societies played a role from the mid-19th century on. In my neck of the woods, the Western New York, the table tappers, those famous sisters who would hold seances. And if you were in the room, tap twice, and they were here. And they could never figure out how they did it. But late in life, one of the sisters seems to have fessed up, and she said, well, we were both double-jointed in our toes. So we could create these clicks, and nobody could tell how we were doing it, right? So it turns out but people got really wrapped up in all of this kind of spiritualism, and it was happening certainly in Europe, in the UK, and on the continent as well. So now we get to our feature players from our classical music point of view, and that's Vienna, Richard Wagner, and Theosophy. It would be impossible to overestimate the influence of Theosophy in this turn toward what we might think of as occult or alternative spiritualities. Really, really important. We think about Theosophy, at least since the 70s, all that. We think of it as kind of like New Age and crystals and candles and all the kind of sort of superficial kind of features of New Age spirituality. But Theosophy, and I'll start there and come back to Wagner. The Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 in New York by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Alcott, moved to India in 1879. The first thing is Helena Blavatsky, an interesting story there, but an important and key figure. A bit of a charlatan in a lot of kinds of ways, a faker, but she was faking certain things, but it's not clear that the things that she was faking were phony. It's just that the way that she was presenting, there was much more theater in it than it sort of worked against her. She was sort of dismissed as a phony. And at the end of her life, sort of, that's the way it ended. But what's interesting, and I think obscured from a lot of American scholars, is that when the Theosophical Society moved to India, They had the wherewithal to establish a library and an archive for manuscripts and the money to be able to fund various kinds of translation projects. They also got involved when Annie Besant took it over in the 20th century, they got involved in the Independence for India movement. And so almost everybody that was doing serious work in philology in India in the beginning of the 20th century was in some way associated with the Theosophical Society because they were advancing and forwarding this work. They were also great champions of Buddhism. Alcott, the other guy, not Blavatsky, was a very big champion and a lot of like Buddhists, Asian Buddhists, got their first exposure to Buddhism from Alcott, this American colonel, living in India. So kind of more there than meets the eye, but very, very important at the end of the 19th century. I'll say in a minute what Mahler's relationship to Theosophy was, and then other Mahler people can say they have other contacts or say that maybe that's not right. But the two books by Blavatsky that you can still get in a Barnes & Noble anywhere in this country is Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. Good luck reading through those books. But they're there. And at one point, people took them very, very seriously. Blavatsky was clearly a very, very intelligent woman. She was very, very smart, but there was a certain kind of snake oil salesman aspect there too. And that kind of overshadowed, unfortunately, the tremendous insight. Wagner, on the other hand, I'm sure many of you know from your familiarity with this music, by the end of his life, there was kind of a cult around Wagner, a kind of a spiritual, religious cult. To a certain extent, at least according to Bill McGrath's book, the book Wagner's book Religion and Art from 1880, or started to be published in 1880, was very, very important. He continues Schopenhauer's philosophy, Wagner does, which he'd endorsed earlier in his writings, and that is that there is only one world will. So this is non-dual philosophy here, monism. The illusion is that we cannot see that we are all one. One and one don't make two, one and one make one, as Pete Townsend would put it. But he says art can penetrate this illusion, or we might say in Indian philosophy, veil of Maya, the illusion that things are separate when in fact they are unified. And so this is, he endorses vegetarianism. I'll bet most of you probably know Mahler was a vegetarian for a period of time. And why? Because he was hanging with some of these people. And he also, strangely, I put an exclamation point there, that's probably even an understatement. Wagner calls for a lack of ego-driven behavior. Well, of course, that's more consistent with Advaita Vedanta and Christian mysticism than it is with Wagner's actual behavior. But you can see he's putting it there because he's got these ideals. And we can have ideals even when we don't live up to them. It's certainly possible to have ideals and to strive toward working up with them. So just to get to the Mahler thing here follow there for just a minute. In the 1880s, Vienna had a significant countercultural scene, or beginning in the 1880s. It continued for 40 years. So you had vegetarians, Pythagoreans, like Friedrich Eckstein, fanatical Wagnerians, all sort of rubbing elbows together. Mahler associated with these people in the 1880s. Of this, there is absolutely no doubt. He was hanging with the kind of fringe countercultural crowd when he was in school. Right? Now, none of us want to be defined by whatever it is we might have done when we were in college, I know. But still, it's not like he was unfamiliar with the stuff. It was everywhere. All of his buddies were involved in it. He became a vegetarian. Eckstein apparently was like the biggest of the Wagner people. It wasn't enough for him to take a train to Bayreuth. He had to walk to Bayreuth in sandals, and a toga, right? So, I mean, this is, you think the 60s were wild. I think there was a lot of craziness going on in the 80s, and it was probably fun. It was probably pretty colorful. And Mahler was involved in all of that. But one of the keys that opens this up is Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner's interpretation of Goethe. I say on my last bullet point in this one that almost all references by Schoenberg and others, including the Viennese theorist Heinrich Schenker, who is a giant among music theorists, all of their references to Goethe's science are almost all according to Rudolf Steiner's interpretation. Now, how can I say this with such confidence? Because by the time these people were looking at Goethe's science in the 1880s, it had basically been debunked by everybody in the German scientific community. It was like, you know, as a scientist, Goethe's a fantastic poet, right? That kind of thing. And so you begin to wonder, well, where they getting it then? Weber's carrying around an annotated paperback Taschenbuch copy of Goethe's Farbenlehre. It's like, why is he doing that in the 1920s, 1930s? Helmholtz said that Goethe was a terrible scientist back in the 80s. You know, what's going on there? And it's because Steiner was a key figure. He was an author. He was both an editor of Goethe's scientific works and the head of theosophy in German-speaking countries. So as an editor for 2 scholarly editions of Goethe's scientific works, he had a kind of academic authority. And he was very, very well-read and well-versed in Kant and Goethe and Schopenhauer and all the rest of it. So when he would explain these ideas, he would do it with a way of referring to serious literature that would cause intellectuals who would normally dismiss such stuff and get them to say, hey, you know, maybe this Steiner's got something here. This sounds like pretty intelligent stuff. So Steiner's interpretation of Goethe is markedly mystical. He talks about the geistige Auge, and this usually arises around Goethe's writing on the Urpflanze. The Urpflanze is the ultimate plant. It is not actually visible to anything except the spiritual eye. That is the eye that sees beyond the material into the spiritual or the intellectual, geistige. You can take it either way. Steiner took it very much took it very much the spiritual way. And in the color theory as well, there is no place where the entire spectrum exists in reality. It can only be created in the mind, this kind of thing. And the whole idea is that Goethe was seeing behind the material world into a spiritual world where he saw the essences of things. Boy, does this sound like Schoenberg talking about music. Boy, does this sound like that. And Steiner had a way of presenting all this in a way that it sounded like you were doing, you were talking about Kant or Hegel. He was very, very good at it. And so he won a lot of intellectuals over. And so his ideas about Goethe would have been the ones that everybody was talking about, even when they didn't know they came from Steiner. Because it was so prevalent. Mahler actually turns out, according to one source, knew Steiner before both of them came to Vienna. It's from the same general area, but there's really no evidence of direct contact between the two in Vienna. Although Mahler's friends were in direct contact with Steiner, so maybe he just didn't like Steiner and didn't want to see him. Maybe he's talked too much or something. Who knows? Theosophy in New York. Gustav and Alma were very aware of theosophy. Of course, I already mentioned that for Gustav, it went all the way back to his college days. But perhaps they only dabbled in it for fun. They knew about it. These are kind of fun ideas, kind of parlor games, this kind of thing. It's maybe worth noting that Brunner Walter became an enthusiastic supporter of theosophy in his later years. This is some decades after the time we're talking about, but he drank it right up and wrote testimonials and this kind of thing. So it couldn't have been too foreign to the world he lived in Vienna during the period together with Mahler. Let's hear what Alma Mahler has to say about it. And some of you may remember this passage from the memoirs. She says, I saw a lot of, this is 1911, I saw a lot of a young American woman who tried to imbue me with the occult. She lent me books by the Theosophists, Ledbetter and Mrs. Besant. There's the cover to the book right there. I always went straight to Mahler the moment she left and repeated word for word all she had said. It was something new in those days, and he was interested. Of course, he knew it went back decades. We started shutting our eyes to see what colors we could see. We practiced this and many other rites ordained by the occultists so zealously that Cookie was once discovered walking up and down the room with her eyes shut. When we asked her what she was doing, she replied, I'm looking for green. That sounds like fun, right? They're not saying these Theosophists are kooks. she's saying, man, we got into it, we were enjoying it. I mean, but this doesn't say, that doesn't have the ring of like a spiritual confession, right? Just that they were aware of it and knew it was happening. And of course, Mahler had experienced things much weirder when he was back in Vienna in the 1880s. So just 2 more minutes here to get us out of here. How does all of this connect, the Vienna connect up with the occult scene in the UK and the US in the 60s? Well, a couple things, three factors. First of all, gurus begin to arrive in the West. Vivekananda comes to Chicago in 1893, ends up in London in 1895. Soyen Shaku, who was a Zen practitioner, was in Chicago in 1893 as well. Yogananda comes to Boston and then California, where he establishes the Self-Realization Fellowship in 1920. The Maharishi comes to California in 59, ends up in London by 67, where he meets the Beatles. That's the beginning of all that thing for them. And then Prabhabhatu, our Hare Krishna fellow, comes to New York in 65 and is in London in 1969, also meets the Beatles. So here's how a lot of this stuff came in terms of particular gurus coming to the West. There was a series of books I articulate in one of my articles that I think is a pretty meaningful sequence. Vivekananda's Raja Yoga from 1896. Walter Wentz's The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the first translation from 1927, was much discussed and much read. Paul Brunton's A Search in Secret India, where the first guru that Brunton meets is Meher Baba, but doesn't think too much of him. Ends up settling on Ramana Maharshi. Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography, Yogi, we've talked about that. And then the English translation of Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which, though it had been written in 1922, didn't appear in translation until 1951 after he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So we got books coming our way, we got gurus coming our way, and then of course there were other Westerners, a number of other Westerners that were teachers. Paul Brunton, Aleister Crowley, Pierre Bernard, Alan Watts, Wei Wu Wei, Ram Dass, all of these people were teachers from the West who were teaching some of this stuff. So by the time we get to the 60s, there is a pretty continuous trail to the hippie mysticism that I'm talking about, has been existing not only since the beginning of the century, but develops directly out of the same scenes that Mahler and Schoenberg and all the rest of them were a part of. So there are our 4 main points here as I review. Can music take us beyond the everyday to the absolute, talking about the alternative spirituality in Vienna, in the US and the UK, and the history that connects them, and Mahler and alternative culture in Vienna and New York. And yours truly, in Rishikesh, I went to the ashram of the Maharishi, where the Beatles spent several weeks in 1968. It's now totally overgrown, but a bunch of us went there and we decided, wouldn't it be fun to get our picture taken in one of the meditation caves? And so there he is, Schoenberg scholar in Rishikesh. Thank you very much for your time. Joe.
At all aware of Laura Langford and the Zeidel Society?
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to have to come.
Yeah, I was asking if you're aware of Laura Langford and the Zeidel Society in New York in the 1880s and 1890s. I don't. So just in brief, Zeidel was the dominant classical musician in New York in those decades. The Zeidel Society in Brooklyn was founded by Laura Langford, who was a theosophist and a direct disciple of Blavatsky. And she studied with Blavatsky in London. She regarded Parsifal as a theosophical text. She regarded it as Wagner's peak achievement. She tried to convert Zeidel to theosophy. She was not successful. But there's a lot of literature on the theosophical embrace of Wagner in New York. And she was herself a clairvoyant and a remarkable woman.
Yeah. Hey, Joe, just if we could just dialogue for just a minute. So what do you think Mahler's take on all this would have been? I mean, I have an idea, but I wonder...
Well, we know the story of Eusapia Palladino. You know the story about how the Autocons and the Mahlers visit a famous medium. This is Alma's story. and they see objects flying in the air. And then she says, as I recall, that she went home with her husband and they talked about it. They were credulous, and they were trying to correlate this with things that Mahler believed and had read. That's all that I, quote, know. I'm much more knowledgeable about Seidel in New York than I am about Mahler in New York. And as I said, the theosophical presence in New York that surrounds Wagnerism in the United States, which is a phenomenon of the 1880s and 1890s, cannot be understood except in relationship to theosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, they say fools rush in where the wise man fears to tread, but I'm kind of a fool, so I'll rush in here. I don't know a ton about Mahler's, all of the Mahler stuff like you folks do. That's not my area. Ask me about Schoenberg, that's fine, but Mahler different. But my sense is that this farewell thing that Thomas was talking about, I mean, if you would follow it according to this philosophy, the farewell and death are not really about the Weltschmerz of my dying or my leaving.
Yes, of course, of
It's
course.
about the detachment from all those things I've been pursuing with such gusto, with all of my will, that I'm now a little bit disillusioned about what all of that was. There's a detachment from the ego, from the engagement, from the involvement. Not a retreat from it, not a lack of participation, but a kind of a separation out where the farewell is to something, not to life, but to the my former understanding, maybe my veil of Maya or my illusion, these kinds of things that Wagner talks about. And finally realizing when you get to a certain stage of your life, after having devoted 10 years to a gig that you thought was the gig that was, your career gig, and you see a death of somebody so dear to you, it shakes you up enough for you to say, maybe I've been on the wrong road, or I've just sort of developed to a new road. Maybe it's what some of these guys were talking about, all these spiritual guys back in the 80s. I mean,
yes, of course. He rethinks his experience of redemption is no longer something triumphant. It has to do with diffusion of the ego. He gets interested in Chinese poetry, which he adapts in Das Lied. So all of these things, your characterization of Mahler just now seems to me actually self-evident.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very curious about the influence of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, and the Zohar, particularly in terms of the relationship not only of God and the mystical world and the spiritual world, but influence how this may have influenced specifically Mahler's works.
Well, yeah, I would be really interested in hearing about that too. That's not an area that I've dug into. One thing I will hazard is that if these various traditions, it's amazing how these traditions distinguish themselves from each other. But once you get down to like the base foundational ideas, how they're almost always the same ones. And why is that? Because we're people and things are the way they are, and we all have various stories of getting to that place. But once we've told the stories and we've gotten to that place, it pretty much looks the same for everyone. So my guess would be that you choose a tradition and you dig far enough, you're going to find some of this same kind of stuff. Now, how influential with Mahler? These other guys can give you a much better idea than I can.
When Wagner sketches out his Buddha opera, Der Sieger, early in his career, and has this outline for what must have been a vastly intriguing work in progress about Buddha's trajectory, which then some elements of that find their way into his treatment of the Siegfried myths. Where was he getting that from? Because that was in the 1840s, and so that would have been long before the work on Parsifal and the turn toward Schopenhauer.
Well, I mean, I can't speak just precisely to the exact Buddhist sources that might have been there. But, the beginning of the 19th century is kind of the awakening of Romanticism and the Schlegels and Schleiermachers and all these kinds of folks. And so a lot of them were beginning to discover these kinds of things in bits and pieces and with translations that were partial, right? And that's the story of the first half of the 19th centuries. We don't get, I mean, the reason why those Max Muller books are so important is because they finally send in the scholars to do complete works, you know, authority. So, but up to that time, I mean, there were all kinds of translations floating around. The French there's a French version of the Bhagavad Gita that was translated from Arabic or something, I think. But anyway, there were other kinds of, I mean, Schopenhauer, for example, knew a lot of this earlier Indian stuff before there had been these big Paul Deussen translations. That happened when Schopenhauer was at the end of his life. So people could find out about these things. Exactly how Wagner did, I can't say. I just know they were around.
Just a quick question. Is okay. Is Mahler's Goethe that we're going to hear next year in the 8th Symphony, is that Steiner's Goethe?
Well, you know, if I come back next year, I would be happy to address that very topic. And I told you how much I love Boulder, Ethan. So I'm just saying.
You were talking about the accuracy of translations, and some of us that have to get familiar with Gustav Holst, it turns out that he learned Sanskrit because he wasn't happy with the translations. And of course, he was, you know, in late 19th century, earliest 20th century. I know that he just wrote an opera, Savitri, which talks about Maya and these sort of things. But why was he dissatisfied with the translations?
Well, yeah, it could be partially. I mean, I don't know, but hazard a guess. A lot of people who get into this believe that, I mean, Sanskrit is very difficult to translate. Some of these, for example, the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali, very big in yoga studios and things like that. But the fact is, if you look at these sentences, they're very, very difficult to translate because there's no verbs. There's just, and so you have to kind of interpret them from what's there. They were kind of notes, shorthand. They're not expository statements. So you can take somebody's word for it, but if you look at 5 different translations, these people all know Sanskrit, but the translations are all different. And you could well say to yourself, I'm never really going to get this until I have the Sanskrit. And even today, I mean, you'd think, how many years has it been since these authoritative translations? Graduate students are still taking Sanskrit and still translating these same kinds of things for themselves in order to feel closer to the original. I mean, just like you take literature. If you're going to do German literature, you don't want to do German literature in translation. If you're really going to understand Goethe or Schopenhauer or read some of Freud, you're going to have to get the German. You're going to feel much closer to it because a translation is always an interpretation, even the best one, unless you've got them facing pages, where you can compare the language against the translation. It's very, very difficult if you don't have the language to really feel like you have a grasp of it. So I'm guessing that's part of what Holst was on his head. I don't know. All right. So, all right. Sounds like we have to move on. I'd like to thank you again very much for your attention and for your being here.